Hello and welcome. My name is Lynn Barger Elliott, and I am the executive producer of Completed Life Podcasts. Today is the second episode of A Lexicon of Life and Death, a new podcast series where, along with Mark Barger Elliott, the executive director of Completed Life Initiative, we explore the vocabulary we use to express beliefs, hopes, and attitudes towards life and death. Language, in other words, can guide us towards embracing full and whole moments in our lives and what we think of as a complete or completed life. Can you guess how many words a 3-year-old knows? The answer is about 300. And until we turn 18, we learn about 4 new words a day. From 18 years on, most of us learn on average 1 new word a day until we peak around the age of 59. At 59, we have about 32,000 words in our vocabulary. And on a typical day, most of us speak about 16,000 words, with females speaking about 500 more words a day than males. And in a typical hour, we speak about 940 words. As I mentioned in our last podcast, I'm fascinated by words. Most mornings, I begin the day with a crossword puzzle and a game of wordscapes. So I was intrigued when I learned that even with up to 32,000 words to choose from, and with the 940 words we speak each hour, sometimes we struggle. We struggle to put an experience, a moment, a feeling into words. In other words, which is a funny phrase if you think about it, with all those words to draw from, we're speechless. As the poet Jane Hirschfield once observed, as humans, we are always attempting to explain something that already exists fully, on its own, without words. That's why, Mark, I love that book you bought me in the store we love at DuPont Circle in DC.
You mean Kramer's? That is such a great place.
Yes, exactly. For our audience, the book is called The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, a title I love. And the idea Minnesota-based author John Koenig had was that because sometimes we can't find or pull up or articulate the exact word to describe a moment or emotion, maybe it would help to combine 2 words into a new word. And Mark, that reminded me of a post you did on your On Emotions blog.
That's right. I wrote like a few months ago about this moment when a colleague asked me if I might be able to join her at a meeting later that day. So I wanted to answer in a way that she knew I could make it. So on the one hand, like a tentative commitment. But I also, on the other hand, wanted her to know that I definitely wanted to be there. So in the moment, I made up my word. I said 10 definitely. Tentative plus definitely. And that's how I felt about attending that meeting. And 10 definitely is obviously not a word, but it seemed kind of the best way to express what I wanted to say and felt in that moment.
I love that. So at that moment, you needed a new word. And that's exactly what Koenig attempts to accomplish in the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. As he writes, sometimes there's a word for something you felt all your life, but didn't know. And that's how this idea for his book was born, he writes. In the jolt of recognition you feel when you learn, for example, there are words for emotions in languages other than English. For example, Huga, Ubuntu, or Schadenfreude. Some of these terms might, well, be untranslatable, Koenig observes, but they still have the power to make the inside of your head feel a little bit more familiar, at least for a moment or two. And he notes it makes you wonder what else might be possible. Of course, we don't usually question why a language has words for some things and not others. And we don't really imagine we have much of a choice in the matter, because the words we use to build our lives were mostly handed to us in the crib and picked up on the playground. What Koenig does in his book is what poet Jane Hirschfield observed: people trying to explain something that already exists fully on its own without words. Koenig decided to create expressions by combining two other words. As he writes, these new words that he created were stitched together from fragments of 100 different languages, both living and dead. And these words were not necessarily intended to be used in conversation, but just to exist for their own sake.
Yeah, and I remember you and I talked about this. The book was really well received. I read how John Green, the author, the best-selling author of The Fault in Our Stars, is a really big fan. He said, and I quote, Koenig creates beautiful new words that we need, but do not yet have.
Exactly. For example, here are a few words of Koenig's that resonated with me. The moment of tranquility we feel when we are indoors during a thunderstorm. Koenig calls that chrysalism, based on the Latin word chrysalis. That feeling of loss when one finishes a good book. He calls loose left, combining the concepts of loose leaf, a sheet of paper, with the word left, or the sense that comes from telling yourself that just one more tweak in your life could solve all your problems. He refers to that as justing, combining the English word just with jousting, the sport won by positioning the tip of your lance at just the right spot. Mark, was there a word that you were drawn to from this book, one that you thought might be helpful to add to our lexicon of life and death? One that might guide us towards complete or completed moments?
There was one that stuck with me, I suppose because it's whimsical while also being profound. It's Suerza. It's spelled Suerza. Koenig explains that he combined the Spanish word for luck, suerta, and the Spanish word for force, fuerza, and created the noun suerza to describe that moment, that feeling of quiet amazement that we exist at all. It's a feeling, as Koenig puts it, that when we recognize we won an unbroken streak of reproductive lotteries that stretches all the way back to the beginning of life itself.
I love that. Talk about a word that describes or helps us appreciate life. That's a word that points us to the wonder of just being alive. It reminds me of the refrain in the musical Hamilton. You remember Alexander's wife, Liza? She sang it first, and then later Alexander could sing it himself. Look around, how lucky we are to be alive right now.
Hmm.
The musical depicts how, for most of his life, Alexander couldn't be satisfied. He always thought he should pursue more. And at a deep level, he never thought he deserved what he had or the privilege of enjoying it. It was only later in his relatively short life, he died when he was 47, that he was able to believe he was worthy of the Suerza, as Koenig put it, or the good fortune that had flowed into his life. Only when he could give into gratitude was he able to sing back those words to his wife, Liza. Look around. How lucky we are to be alive right now.
Hmm. It reminds me there was that movie a long time ago. I think the title was Against All Odds. And I think that's the sentiment you're sort of describing. I'm here, I'm alive against all odds. And that creates this feeling of awe, of wonder, of gratitude. And Koenig is sort of saying, well, that feeling, it deserves a word.
For sure. Last week, I mentioned how studies show language is always changing and how 690 words are added to the dictionary every year. But as Koenig helpfully describes, there are still blind spots in our language. There are still Jane Hirschfield situations where we might need to step beyond the dictionary and create a new word, a word we can add to our lexicon of life and death.
Suerza.
And there's nothing definitely about it. How lucky we are to be alive right now.
Indeed.
And when we experience and name that moment, is it not, in and of itself, a complete moment?
I think so.
In the upcoming episodes of this podcast, we will continue to add words to the lexicon of life and death. We'll look to words from the English language as well as others. We'll reflect on the book, The Genius of Language by Wendy Lesser. And we'll look to Susie Dent, author of Past Perfect. In the meantime, we invite you to listen to our other podcast series, Voices of the Completed Life and Gifts of the Completed Life. To find them, please go to our website, completedlife.org, click on the tab marked Programs, and then scroll down to Podcasts. Thank you to Mark Barger Elliott for joining me today, and to Zoe Wilshire, editor of Completed Life Podcasts. If you would like to be in touch with us or have an idea or story for a Completed Life podcast, please email us at info@completedlife.org. Thank you again for joining us today.